In 1900, Britain controlled 1/4 of all the land on Earth and produced more wealth than any other nation in recorded human history. Yet within 50 years, that same empire would be borrowing money from its former colony just to keep its own government from collapsing entirely. Welcome to True Earth History, where hidden history comes to life. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind the headlines. The British Empire was not destroyed by a foreign enemy, or a natural disaster, or a sudden military defeat on any battlefield. It was destroyed by a series of economic decisions made by men who believed they were saving the empire when they were ending it. To understand how the most powerful economic force in modern history collapsed, you have to go back to a single room in London. In 1694, the Bank of England was created, and for the next 2 centuries, it became the financial heartbeat of the entire global economy. The British pound became the most trusted currency on earth, and London became the place where every major financial transaction in the world was settled. By the late 1800s, Britain was the banker of the world, lending money to governments on every continent from South America to Southeast Asia. British investors owned railways in Argentina, mines in South Africa, plantations in India, and factories across the entire industrializing world without exception. The country had built something no empire before it had ever achieved, a financial network so large it touched almost every economy on the planet. But hidden inside that extraordinary success was a vulnerability that almost nobody in power chose to see or even wanted to acknowledge. Britain had become so dependent on its global financial network that any serious disruption to world trade could shake its entire economic foundation deeply. The country was importing more than it was exporting, and it was covering that gap with income from overseas investments and financial services alone. This meant that Britain was no longer a production economy in the traditional sense, but had transformed into something closer to a financial services empire. Factories in Germany and the United States were growing faster, producing cheaper goods and capturing markets that British manufacturers had once dominated without any competition. Britain did not panic about this because the income from its global investments was large enough to hide how serious the industrial decline truly was. Then in 1914, everything changed in a single moment, when a political assassination in Sarajevo pulled the entire world into a conflict of devastating scale. The First World War was the financial turning point that Britain never recovered from, and very few historians explain just how catastrophic that cost truly was. In 1914, Britain was a creditor nation, meaning the rest of the world owed Britain far more money than Britain owed anyone else combined. By 1918, that position had completely reversed, and Britain had transformed from the world's largest creditor into one of the world's largest debtors almost overnight. The war cost Britain approximately £11 billion, a figure so enormous it is almost impossible to comprehend in any meaningful human context. To put that number in perspective, the entire British government budget before the war was less than £200 million in a single year. Britain had spent roughly 55 years worth of its entire government budget in just 4 years of industrial-scale warfare across the European continent. The country borrowed heavily from the United States, sold off billions of pounds worth of overseas investments, and printed money on an unprecedented scale. By the end of the war, the golden financial foundation that had supported British power for 2 centuries had been fundamentally and permanently weakened. But the men in charge of the British economy did not accept this new reality, and that refusal to accept it would prove catastrophic. Instead of adapting to the post-war world, British economic leaders made a decision that economic historians still describe as one of the greatest mistakes ever made. In 1925, Chancellor of the Exchequer Winston Churchill announced that Britain would return to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate of the pound. This single decision, announced quietly in a government budget speech, would go on to cause enormous economic suffering for millions of ordinary British people. The gold standard meant that the value of the British pound was fixed to a specific amount of gold and could not be adjusted freely. Returning to the pre-war rate meant the pound was priced too high compared to what the British economy could actually support at that point. An overvalued pound made British exports more expensive for foreign buyers, which meant British factories struggled to sell their goods in international markets competitively. At the same time, imports became cheaper for British consumers, which meant foreign goods flooded into Britain and competed directly with domestic manufacturers already under pressure. The result was a slow economic suffocation that fell hardest on the industrial working-class communities of northern England, Wales and Scotland specifically. Unemployment in coal mining, steel production, shipbuilding and textile manufacturing climbed to levels that had never been seen in modern British economic history before. By 1926, the tension had built to a breaking point, and Britain experienced its first and only general strike, when millions of workers stopped simultaneously. For 9 days in May 1926, transport workers, miners, printers, and factory hands across the country laid down their tools in unified protest. The government called it a threat to the constitutional order and mobilized soldiers, police, and thousands of volunteer strikebreakers to keep essential services running. The general strike eventually collapsed, but the bitterness it created between the British government and the working class would last for generations to come. More importantly, the underlying economic problem that caused the strike was never actually solved because the government refused to abandon the gold standard policy. The economist John Maynard Keynes had warned Churchill directly before the decision was made that returning to gold at the pre-war rate was a serious mistake. Keynes calculated that the pound was overvalued by approximately 10%, and he predicted that the consequences would fall on workers rather than on financial elites. His prediction proved accurate almost immediately, but Churchill and the financial establishment of the Bank of England refused to change course for 6 more years. Meanwhile, the global economy was shifting in ways that made the British position increasingly fragile with every year that passed through the late 1920s. The United States had emerged from the First World War as the dominant economic power, with New York replacing London as the global financial center of gravity. American banks were lending money across Europe. American factories were producing goods more efficiently, and American investors were pouring capital into markets at extraordinary speed. Then in October 1929, the New York stock market crashed, and the financial shock traveled across the Atlantic like a wave of enormous destructive force. The Great Depression that followed was not just an American problem, it became a global catastrophe that hit Britain at its most economically vulnerable moment. International trade collapsed by more than 60% within 3 years, and the overseas investment income that Britain depended on dried up almost completely. Countries that owed money to Britain could no longer pay, export markets for British goods vanished, and unemployment in Britain surged to over 3 million people. The gold standard, which was already causing damage, now became an anchor dragging the entire British economy toward the ocean floor at increasing speed. To defend the pound under the gold standard, the Bank of England was forced to keep interest rates high even as the economy was collapsing. High interest rates made it more expensive for businesses to borrow money, which meant investment fell, factories closed, and more workers joined the unemployment lines. The British government, following the economic orthodoxy of the time, responded by cutting public spending rather than increasing it to support the struggling economy. Wages were cut, benefits were reduced, and public works programs were scaled back precisely at the moment when ordinary people needed economic support the most. This approach, which was called sound finance by its supporters, did not stabilize the economy. It deepened the suffering and extended the duration of the crisis. By 1931, the situation had become so severe that Britain faced a genuine government financial crisis, with the pound under intense, speculative attack from international markets. Foreign investors and central banks were withdrawing gold from the Bank of England at such a rapid rate that British reserves were nearly exhausted entirely. The national government, formed in August 1931 as an emergency coalition, faced an impossible choice between economic orthodoxy and national economic survival in real time. On September 21, 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard and the pound was allowed to fall freely against other currencies for the first time. The pound lost approximately 25% of its value almost immediately, but something unexpected and remarkable happened in the weeks and months that followed this. With the pound no longer overvalued, British exports became more competitive, interest rates could be lowered, and the economy began a slow and painful recovery. The lesson was clear in hindsight. The gold standard had been the problem all along, and abandoning it brought relief rather than the disaster that had been feared. But the damage done during the 6 years of gold standard policy between 1925 and 1931 had left deep and lasting scars on the British economy. Entire industrial communities in the north of England had been hollowed out, and a generation of workers had lost years of productive economic life permanently. The psychological damage was equally serious, because the British establishment had lost confidence in its own ability to manage a modern industrial economy effectively. There was a growing sense among economists, politicians, and ordinary citizens that something fundamental had gone wrong with the British economic model itself. But before Britain could properly address its structural economic problems, the world descended into another catastrophic conflict that would cost the country even more than the first. The Second World War, which began in 1939, was even more financially devastating for Britain than the First World War had been a generation earlier. By 1941, Britain was spending more money on the war than its entire national income, which was only possible through massive borrowing from every available source. The United States provided critical support through the Lend-Lease program, which supplied Britain with food, weapons, vehicles, and industrial equipment on a staggering scale. Lend-Lease kept Britain in the war, but it also created a debt relationship with the United States that would shape British economic policy for decades. Britain also borrowed heavily from countries within its own empire, particularly India, which by the end of the war was actually a creditor to Britain itself. The reversal was almost impossible to comprehend. A colony that Britain had economically extracted from for nearly 2 centuries was now funding the British war effort. By 1945, the war was won, but Britain emerged from that victory in a state of near total financial exhaustion that the public barely understood. The country had sold off nearly all of its remaining overseas investments, accumulated enormous debts to both the United States and countries within its own empire. Physical infrastructure across British cities had been damaged by years of aerial bombardment, and industrial equipment that had been pushed beyond its limits needed complete replacement. The British people, who had sacrificed enormously during 6 years of war, expected and demanded that the post-war government deliver a better life for everyone. In July 1945, they voted out Winston Churchill and elected a Labour government under Clement Attlee with one of the largest electoral majorities in British history. The Attlee government had enormous ambitions, creating the National Health Service, nationalising key industries, and building a welfare state that would protect citizens from poverty. These were genuinely historic achievements that transformed British society, but they required enormous financial resources at precisely the moment when Britain had almost none available. In December 1945, Britain negotiated a loan from the United States worth $3.75 billion, which came with significant and painful economic conditions attached to it. One of those conditions required Britain to make the pound convertible to other currencies within 1 year, a requirement that would have devastating consequences very quickly. When convertibility was introduced in July 1947, international holders of pounds immediately began converting them to dollars at such a rapid rate it caused a crisis. Within just 5 weeks, Britain had lost more than $1 billion of its currency reserves, and the convertibility experiment had to be suspended in emergency. The crisis revealed just how weak the British financial position truly was, and how little room the country had to maneuver in the post-war world. Britain was attempting to maintain a global empire, a welfare state, a large military, and a strong currency, all at the same time, with inadequate resources. The strain of trying to do everything at once was slowly pulling the British economy in multiple directions simultaneously, and something was going to have to give way. The empire itself was beginning to unravel, with India and Pakistan gaining independence in 1947 in the most significant loss of imperial territory in British history. Each independence movement that followed removed another source of economic extraction that the British economy had quietly depended on for generations without public acknowledgement. At the same time, the United States was rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan, and American goods, American culture, and American economic influence was spreading everywhere. Britain received Marshall Plan money too, but it used much of it to maintain its global military commitments rather than to modernize its domestic industrial base. Germany and France, stripped of their empires or their military burdens, were free to invest their Marshall Plan funds directly into rebuilding their industrial economies. This difference in how Reconstruction money was spent would have profound consequences for British economic competitiveness throughout the entire second half of the 20th century. While German factories were being rebuilt with modern equipment and French infrastructure was being modernized, British factories were still running on pre-war machinery and methods. The productivity gap between Britain and its European competitors began to widen in the late 1940s and would continue widening for the next 3 decades without interruption. Britain had won the war but was losing the peace, and the economic decisions being made in the late 1940s were quietly setting the stage for decades of relative decline. By 1949, the British pound had already been devalued once, dropping from $4.03 to $2.80, a public admission that the economy was under serious strain. That devaluation was supposed to make British exports competitive again, but the deeper structural problems inside the British economy remained completely untouched by the currency adjustment. The fundamental issue was that British industry had not modernized fast enough, and the gap between British productivity and that of its competitors was growing wider each year. In the early 1950s, Britain still controlled a large global empire, still maintained one of the largest militaries in the world, and still pretended to be a superpower. That pretense was enormously expensive, and the cost of maintaining global military bases, colonial administrations, and the nuclear weapons program stretched the national budget to its absolute limits. Britain spent a higher percentage of its national income on defense than almost any other Western nation during the 1950s, far more than Germany or France or Japan. Those countries, freed from the burden of global military commitments, were channeling their resources into factories, infrastructure, education, and technology with remarkable and measurable results. The West German economy grew so fast in the 1950s that economists gave it a name, the Wirtschaftswunder, which translated simply as the economic miracle of the century. Japan, devastated by the war, rebuilt its industrial base with modern technology and disciplined investment, and within 2 decades became one of the most competitive economies on Earth. Britain, by contrast, was managing decline rather than engineering a revival, making small adjustments around the edges without addressing the structural weaknesses at the core of everything. The nationalized industries that the Attlee government had created were often inefficient, underfunded, and resistant to modernization because political considerations frequently overrode economic ones in decision-making. Coal mines that should have been mechanized were kept running with outdated methods to preserve employment, even when the economic logic for doing so had completely disappeared. Steel plants that needed consolidation and modernization were kept fragmented and underinvested because the political cost of rationalization was too high for any government to absorb willingly. The railway system, nationalized in 1948, required enormous capital investment to modernize, but that capital was never consistently provided at the scale the network actually required. Across industry after industry, the same pattern repeated itself: short-term political decisions that delayed necessary change and allowed competitive disadvantages to become permanently embedded in the economy. By the mid-1950s, a new term had entered the British political vocabulary, one that would define the national conversation for the next 3 decades without resolution. That term was the British disease, and it referred to a combination of low productivity, poor industrial relations, resistance to change, and chronic underinvestment in modern technology. Industrial relations in Britain during this period were genuinely difficult, with hundreds of strikes per year disrupting production across key sectors of the manufacturing economy constantly. The relationship between trade unions, management, and government had become adversarial in a way that damaged productivity and made British industry less reliable in the eyes of buyers. Foreign companies and governments that had once automatically ordered British ships, British locomotives, and British machinery began looking to Germany, Japan, and the United States instead. British market share in global manufacturing exports fell steadily through the 1950s and 1960s, not because of any single catastrophic event, but through a slow accumulation of small failures. The motorcycle industry is one example that captures the broader pattern in a way that is easy to understand and almost painful to observe in retrospect. In the early 1950s, British motorcycle manufacturers dominated the global market, with brands like Triumph and Norton respected and purchased in countries all around the world. Japanese manufacturers, led by Honda, entered the market with lighter, more reliable, more fuel-efficient machines produced at lower cost through modern manufacturing processes and methods. The British industry responded slowly, failed to invest adequately in new designs, and by the early 1970s had effectively lost the global motorcycle market almost entirely. The same story played out in cars, in electronics, in shipbuilding, in textiles, and in countless other industries where British firms had once held dominant positions internationally. The Suez Crisis of 1956 delivered a different kind of blow, one that was not primarily economic, but that had profound economic consequences for British global standing. When Britain and France attempted to seize the Suez Canal after Egypt nationalized it, the United States applied intense financial pressure to force a humiliating British withdrawal. The United States threatened to sell its holdings of British pounds, which would have caused a currency collapse, and that threat was enough to end the operation immediately. For the first time in living memory, Britain had been publicly forced to back down from a major foreign policy action because it could not afford the financial consequences. The message was unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Britain was no longer a truly independent global power. It was a nation constrained by its economic dependence on Washington. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan understood the lesson of Suez deeply, and in 1960 he delivered his famous Winds of Change speech acknowledging that the Empire era was ending. The decolonization process accelerated through the 1960s, with dozens of African and Asian nations gaining independence and Britain withdrawing from military commitments east of the Suez Canal. Each withdrawal reduced the cost burden slightly, but it also removed whatever economic privileges had come with colonial relationships, and the net effect was difficult to calculate precisely. Britain was simultaneously losing its empire and failing to build the modern industrial economy that would have replaced the income and strategic influence that empire had provided. The 1960s brought a new government under Harold Wilson, who spoke passionately about modernizing Britain through what he called the white heat of technology and scientific progress. Wilson created the Ministry of Technology, invested in science education, and attempted to build a modern industrial strategy that would close the productivity gap with competitors. But his government also inherited a pound that was still overvalued relative to economic reality, and the decision about whether to devalue it consumed enormous political energy for years. Wilson resisted devaluation for 3 years because he believed it would be seen as a national humiliation and would undermine confidence in his government and its economic competence. In November 1967, after years of defending an indefensible position, Wilson was finally forced to devalue the pound from $2.80 to $2.40 in a public announcement. He appeared on television and told the British public that the pound in your pocket had not been devalued, a statement that was technically true but economically misleading. The devaluation was the right decision economically, but the years of delay had cost the country significant reserves and had prevented earlier adjustments that could have helped faster. The late 1960s and early 1970s were a period of rising economic anxiety in Britain, with inflation climbing, industrial disputes increasing, and public confidence in economic management falling. In 1971, the global monetary system that had been built at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 collapsed, when the United States ended the dollar connection to gold. This created a new era of floating exchange rates, which gave governments more flexibility, but also introduced new forms of currency instability that Britain was poorly positioned to manage. The year 1973 brought a shock that hit Britain harder than almost any other developed economy because of decisions that had been made years and decades earlier. The Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries imposed an oil embargo that caused global oil prices to quadruple in a matter of weeks, with devastating economic effects. Britain in 1973 was still heavily dependent on coal and oil for its industrial energy, and the price shock hit manufacturing costs, transport, and heating simultaneously across the country. The coal miners, knowing their leverage in this energy crisis, went on strike for higher wages, and the Conservative government of Edward Heath faced an existential political challenge. Heath imposed a 3-day working week on British industry to conserve energy, meaning factories across the country could only operate 3 days out of every 7. The image of Britain in early 1974 was one of power cuts, candlelit offices, limited television broadcasting, and a general sense that the country was coming apart economically. Heath called a general election asking the country who governs Britain, and the answer from voters was ambiguous enough that it led to his eventual removal from office. The Wilson government that followed negotiated a settlement with the miners, but the underlying economic damage from the oil shock continued to ripple through the British economy severely. Inflation in Britain reached extraordinary levels during the mid-1970s, peaking at over 25% annually in 1975, which meant the purchasing power of wages was being rapidly destroyed. A 25% inflation rate means that goods costing £100 in January would cost £125 by December of the same year. For ordinary working people, this meant that wage increases were constantly chasing price increases in a way that created enormous economic anxiety and industrial unrest across the country. The government attempted to control inflation through voluntary wage restraint agreements with trade unions, but these agreements were difficult to enforce and frequently broke down under pressure. By 1976, the situation had reached a point of genuine crisis that would mark one of the most humiliating moments in modern British economic history, without any question. The British government, facing a collapse in the value of the pound and unable to fund its public spending through borrowing on acceptable terms, was forced to act. Chancellor Denis Healey went to the International Monetary Fund and requested an emergency loan of approximately $3.9 billion, the largest loan the organization had ever provided to any country. The International Monetary Fund agreed to provide the loan, but attached strict conditions that required Britain to cut public spending, reduce the money supply, and limit wage increases. For many people in Britain and around the world, the image of a former empire begging for emergency financial assistance from an international body was almost impossible to process emotionally. Britain had once been the lender of last resort for much of the world, the country that other nations turned to when their own finances were in crisis. Now that same country was standing before an international institution with conditions attached to its rescue, conditions that constrained its own domestic economic policy in significant ways. The International Monetary Fund loan and its conditions marked a psychological turning point in how British political and economic leaders thought about the role of government in the economy. The experience convinced many in the political establishment that government spending beyond a certain level was dangerous, that debt was a trap, and that markets needed to be trusted more. This shift in thinking helped create the conditions for what would become one of the most radical economic transformations any developed country had attempted in the post-war period. The winter of 1978 and 1979 is remembered in Britain as the winter of discontent, a period when a wave of strikes disrupted public services across the entire country. Rubbish went uncollected in city streets, hospital workers walked out, and in some areas gravediggers refused to work, creating conditions that shocked the public and dominated news coverage. The winter of discontent destroyed public confidence in the Labour government of James Callaghan and created the political opening for a fundamental change in economic direction. In May 1979, Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister, and she arrived in government with a clear ideological conviction that the British economy needed to be rebuilt from its foundations. Thatcher believed that decades of government intervention, nationalisation, and accommodation of trade union power had created the structural weaknesses that were destroying British economic performance systematically. Her government raised interest rates sharply to reduce inflation, cut public spending, and began a program of privatizing nationalized industries that had no precedent in British peacetime history. The immediate consequence of her early economic policies was a severe recession in 1980 and 1981, during which unemployment rose above 3 million people for the first time since the 1930s. Entire communities built around steel, coal, shipbuilding, and manufacturing were devastated as the government refused to provide the subsidies that had previously kept uncompetitive industries operating and employing people. The human cost was concentrated in specific geographic areas: the north of England, South Wales, central Scotland, and parts of the Midlands, regions that had not recovered from the 1920s. Supporters of the Thatcher program argued that the short-term pain was necessary to remove inefficiencies that had been accumulating for decades and were preventing genuine long-term growth. Critics argued that the destruction of manufacturing communities was unnecessary, that alternative policies could have modernized industry without the social devastation that accompanied the rapid de-industrialization of Britain. Both arguments contain elements of truth, and the debate about whether Thatcher saved the British economy or permanently damaged large parts of it continues to generate fierce disagreement today. What is historically verifiable is that the British economy did eventually recover through the mid-1980s, with inflation falling, productivity rising, and financial services expanding dramatically in London. The Big Bang deregulation of the London financial markets in 1986 transformed the City of London into one of the most dynamic and globally connected financial centers on Earth. But this financial revival came at a cost, because it deepened the divide between a prosperous service economy concentrated in London and a struggling former industrial economy in other regions. The pattern of regional economic inequality that had been visible since the 1920s was not resolved by the Thatcher Revolution. It was in many ways made more permanent and more visible. By the early 1990s, Britain faced another painful moment when it attempted to anchor the pound within the European exchange rate mechanism as a way of maintaining currency stability. On September 16, 1992, a day remembered as Black Wednesday, currency speculators led by George Soros bet against the British pound on a scale the government could not resist. The British government spent over £27 billion attempting to defend the pound within the required exchange rate band, but the pressure from international markets was simply overwhelming. By the evening, Britain had been forced to withdraw from the exchange rate mechanism, and the pound fell sharply, in another public humiliation, with deep historical echoes from earlier decades. Once again, as in 1931 and in 1967, the pattern repeated itself. Britain had attempted to maintain an overvalued currency and had been forced by market reality to abandon the effort. The exit from the exchange rate mechanism was economically beneficial in the medium term, just as the exits from gold in 1931 and from the fixed rate in 1967 had been. But the repeated pattern of defending unsustainable positions, suffering public humiliation, and then benefiting from the forced adjustment raises a profound question about British economic decision-making overall. Why did Britain repeatedly choose to defend currency positions that were economically indefensible, suffering enormous costs in reserves and lost output, before finally accepting the inevitable adjustment each time? The answer lies in the intersection of imperial psychology and economic policy. The deep British reluctance to publicly acknowledge that the country was no longer the financial power it once was. The decisions that caused the most damage to the British economy were not made by incompetent people. They were made by intelligent people who could not let go of a self-image. A self-image built on 2 centuries of financial and imperial dominance that created expectations of British economic centrality long after the material foundations of that centrality had disappeared entirely. The economic suicide of the British Empire was not a single act, but a long series of choices made by people who preferred a comforting illusion to an uncomfortable truth. Every nation that has ever held great power faces this same test eventually, the test of whether it can adapt its self-understanding to match its actual economic position in the world. Britain took generations to pass that test, and the communities that paid the highest price were the ones who had the least influence over the decisions that shaped their lives entirely. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. The past holds powerful lessons and I will help you discover them.